Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. Tonight, I want to tell you a little bit about some new discoveries and some new ways of thinking about shell mounds on the St. John's. And before we really get into that topic, the details there, I was reminded today that in many parts of Florida, most of the shell mounds that you find are not of archaic age. In fact, they're post-archaic. And along the St. John's River Valley, particularly the middle and upper St. John's from, say, Vero Beach all the way up to Palatka, shell mounds are the most visible manifestation of middle archaic all the way up through St. John's period lifeways. There are a number of variations on a theme. I mean, ostensibly, yeah, they're made out of shellfish. In this case, they're all freshwater shell. Except for those objects that have been imported in from either coast. The kinds of shellfish include, by volume, it's normally around 90 to 95%, or a small snail called the banded mystery snail, or Viviparus georgianus. All the kids at field school always love walking around calling things the banded mystery snail. It's very mysterious. It's very mysterious for a number of reasons. One is that we can't find them today. They are, in some cases, some of these mounds equal between 8,000 and 10,000 cubic meters of shell. Most of that being these small little guys here. They're about the size of a marble. And we've had a hard time actually finding them today. And they've not been extirpated, but they've suffered greatly from the past century. We know, going back from the work of Wyman and C.B. Moore, that there are many variations on a theme. Of course, except for a few cases, we weren't given the great topographic maps to go along with particularly Wyman's and C.B. Moore's excavations. So that's one problem. But we do know that examples, the linear shell ridge that we'll be talking about a great deal here, is a predominant type throughout much of the river valley. We know now that they're very early. In fact, they're some of the earliest shell deposits in the eastern woodlands, up around 7,300 years ago. Calibrated radiocarbon years ago is when these things really kick off. And then they were repeatedly occupied for millennia. So these were places that were really important on the landscape, and we're going to talk a little bit about what some of those reasons may have been. I would also point out that much like the other shell mounds throughout the eastern United States, the St. John's shell mounds have been ravaged by both time and industry. We know this is a photograph. Well, I don't need to go that far yet. This is a photograph taken either by C.B. Moore or one of C.B. Moore's compatriots at Huntington Island, which some of you probably know well from Barbara Purdy's work there. And this is the small end of the mound. It's about 14, 15 feet high. This would have risen up to 10 meters or 30 feet high on the back side of the mound. Most of that is now gone. That was taken away for shell mining, which really kicked off in the 1920s and 1930s. We know that there were at least 40, if not upwards of 100 of these mounds throughout the valley. But again, most of them have been wiped out except for 7, which are now in state parks or federal parks property, so they're preserved. And so the current research that I've been engaging in, and Ken Sasman and then John Endonino, who's also at the University of Florida, have been focusing on trying to extract as much information as possible about the origins and histories of these places, since they're really enigmatic in that they are so early, they are so massive, and they were apparently used for a number of different practices throughout much of the Archaic and later on. So I want to talk about two major issues, and one is what are some of the current interpretations of archaic shell mounds, particularly along the St. John's River Valley, and what are some of the problems that are inherent with those interpretations based on a couple empirical problems that we've identified most recently. And then what's another framework and what kind of data do we actually need to reconstruct how these places emerged through time and how they might have changed in terms of their significance to the people who inhabited them and who built them. And so regarding the first issue, we can speak a little bit more specifically about the culture history of these different places. We know of the Archaic in the middle of St. John's is typically divided into two broad time periods. One is the Mount Taylor period from around 7,300 to 4,700 years ago. And that's a time period of when most of the mounds were actually inhabited and constructed. The Mount Taylor period is known as for a number of regional firsts. So the earliest canoes have been dated to the Mount Taylor period. It's certainly the earliest widespread use of shellfish that we have evidence for. Now granted, a lot of these firsts are problematic because before 7,300 years ago, the St. John's River Valley was very different than it is today. This is right around when sea level began to stabilize, although it was still about 5 meters below where it is today. And so many of the earlier places, like Windover Pond, some of you are probably familiar with, are now either buried under meters of later deposits or literally underwater. And so we really don't know what was going on in the St. John's before 7,300 years ago. And we won't until we actually start doing some underwater excavations, which we'll talk about here in a moment. Another aspect of Mount Taylor lifeways was widespread exchange. That even though they were living in the St. John's, which is somewhat peripheral to the rest of the southeastern United States, we know that they were trading with folks as far away as northern Mississippi, into the Savannah River Valley and beyond, and likely many of the marine shell beads that are being found in the shell mound archaic sites in the Tennessee River Valley are probably coming either definitely from the coast of Florida and maybe even from the Mount Taylor groups in the middle St. John's River Valley. So still cosmopolitan even if they're very far away. And it's kind of a theme that runs throughout archaic culture history within the region. And finally, the second end of the Archaic period, typically known as the Orange period, right? And this is along the St. John's. Orange is best known for the earliest fiber-tempered pottery in Florida. It's actually about a century younger than the earliest fiber-tempered pottery on the coast. And whether it was potters themselves or or just trade of the technology of pottery making, that's what we really start to see fiber-tempered pottery being found throughout much of the tops of these mounds. Now, how have these things been thought about? Well, because they're made of shellfish remains, and ostensibly because shellfish were being consumed during the Archaic period, most of these mounds have been seen as a proxy for past environmental conditions. Right? And in particular, today, the ones that we know of very well tend to be found either on the main channel of the river. This is actually a shot from Hunting Island, or these broad lagoons, right, that are even today very productive. The second half of that equation is that if they represent abundant resources and intensive shell fishing, that because people kept coming back to these shell mounds over the course of 3,000, 4,000, even 6,000 years in some cases, that there was continuity through time in terms of what people were actually doing at them, i.e. they were just shell fishing and depositing shellfish upon the mounds. And so this idea has been thought of as these mounds are basically garbage piles, right, where people were simply depositing shellfish over generations and generations and generations without any larger significance of the places themselves. Now, Houston, we have a few problems. One is that the mounds for the most part share very similar shapes. And that might be expected if you think of folks having a highly structured or predetermined notion of what, say, a garbage pile might be, right? You would just keep reproducing what that garbage pile should look like. But when you start digging into the mounds themselves, you find out that they have very different histories. That is, some of them are very early and some of them are very late, and they all tend to share these similar forms. A second major problem, which has really only been dealt with most recently, is that they clearly were not just places of refuse. Mounds such as Harris Creek and elsewhere, and this is actually a stratigraphic profile drawn by C.B. Moore, we know that some of these mounds, at least portions of them, were intentionally constructed as burial monuments. Right? And so at Orange Mound, C.B. Moore documented a brown sand layer with shell as well as human bones. And then I think more problematic for the mounds as garbage heaps, things like large white sand layers that we know today couldn't have been brought there by any natural process. But dating very early, right? This is actually relatively low in the sequence. And so we know that these mounds, some of them anyways, were places of burial and veneration. Another problem is that many of these mounds are truly shell mounds, and they don't contain the kinds of things you would expect of day-to-day living. They might have some faunal remains, but given the ratio of shell to fauna is actually very high, and so there's not a lot of evidence that people were eating anything other than, say, shellfish there. You don't find, in some of them anyways, you don't find a lot of objects of daily living, right? So not a lot of stone tools, whereas in others you do. And then more recently, some isotopic studies that have been done on archaic burials has suggested that shellfish were not nearly as important in the diet as they've been thought to have been, right? So instead of being 30 or 40%, maybe more like 10 to 15%. And given the scale of and the size of these shell mounds, we need to rethink, I think, of what people are actually doing there. In brief, something that we've been working on at UF is trying to reframe the questions, right? Instead of asking, why are these composed of shellfish? Why do people keep coming back to these places, right? And how could they be changed through time? How could people reappropriate the spaces of the past, right, and use them in new and creative ways? My own angle has been that much like many other hunter-gatherer societies that have been documented ethnographically, as well as archaeologically, that they tend to, that they don't easily separate their places of veneration and their places of day-to-day activities the way we do, right? So there's no major break between, say, a sacred space and a secular space. That all those spaces tend to come together. And we really need to focus on the kinds of practices that people are engaging in at shell mounds, right? So are they just depositing shell? Are they just depositing shell in the context of human burials, right? Are they depositing shell in the context of big parties, which seems to be one of the going themes throughout many of the mounds. And so the questions we've been asking about require a lot of new data regarding the temporality of when these sites were used, the scale of inhabitation, right? How quickly these things were constructed, were they constructed in stages, and the like. And so just point out that what we've been trying to do at UF is go back and actually ask some really basic questions about where these sites are located. What are they actually composed of? Are they actually composed of as much shellfish as we thought? Can we find evidence for daily residential day-to-day living? Can we find evidence for burial? Can we find production areas? Can we find evidence for larger environmental changes that might have affected where people could live and how they can make a living? Just doing things that, instead of just presuming that they're either monuments, right, which has been the thing most recently, are they just monumental, or are they garbage heaps, or are they something kind of in between? My own research has been focusing on going back to the basics, right? Going back to the old boys like Jeffries Wyman and C.B. Moore, and figuring out where did they identify archaic sites, the ones particularly that have been destroyed. what kinds of objects did they find there? Did they note human bones? You know, we know that Harris Creek and some other sites were clearly mortuary mounds, but you know, are there other places on the landscape that potentially could have been also used as burial mounds? Second is bringing the study of the St. John's mounds into the modern age. My own specialty is geographic information systems, or GIS, and in particularly using remote sensing techniques. And one that I've been using recently is called LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging. And it's a way to, instead of using hand-based methods like total stations to survey sites, you can survey them from the air. Right? And you can survey an archaeological site literally in a minute instead of the months that it might take to survey and get a true good topographic map. And so been using LiDAR coverage here that I'll show you in a moment. And then finally, of course, recent excavations. We've targeted a number of different shell mounds, and we've tried to only focus on sites that have already been destroyed or thought or presumed to have been destroyed. And of course, what we find is even though shell miners came in and might have excavated 80%, one of the unintended consequences of shell mining is, of course, that they've opened up the basal components of these sites that you normally wouldn't have access to, since they'd be under 8 meters of shell. And so this field school student here is digging into what's left of what was probably a 5 to 6 meter high shell mound. This is all archaic in age, and it's the interior escarpment of a mound that was left by shell mining. And so we go in, take good column samples, get good radiocarbon samples, and see what we can figure out from each of these places. So to get back to this question of when were people living at these sites, you know, was it truly continuity? When we look at the radiocarbon determinations for the entire river valley, we've got about 58 now. We've got a couple more actually coming back from Beta Analytic in a few weeks, so we'll fill this out a little bit more. But basically what this graph is showing is that from roughly 7,300 years ago, right when shellfish starts to be consumed, and all the way up through the orange period, there's no major break, right? There's no discontinuities within the region, right? People didn't leave. They were at least living within the region for over the course of 4,000 years. Now, when we actually look at it by site, we find some really interesting patterns. Most notably is that even though, and these are radiocarbon samples that have been ordered by latitude from north to south, we find that some sites, such as Groves Orange Midden, this is a site that Barbara Purdy and others published on, and this was one of the reasons we always thought that these mounds exhibited continuity, is that, you know, there are a number of radiocarbon dates that actually spread across the entire Archaic period. But when we start looking at other sites that have been relatively well dated, we find that in fact there are noticeable breaks in habitation. Some sites will be very early on, and then you'll have another occupation after a few centuries. Some do continue on more or less continuously, but we get this sense of very complicated history in terms of where people were living at any given point in time when we actually start looking at it on a site-by-site basis. In addition to thinking about the actual or the time periods in which people were living in the valley, we've also got to come to grips with the kinds of environmental contexts that they were dealing with over the course of 3,000 or 4,000 years. And so we know that around when people first started moving into the St. John's, probably as early as Clovis, if you're a fan of pre-Clovis, maybe even then. But at least by 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, we do have diagnostic Paleo-Indian points, typically on well-watered springs. But it isn't until 7,300 years ago that surface waters had gotten to a point where they had stabilized enough. And we think that at this time period, people began living right down on the edge of the banks. We'd have a near modern St. John's, probably a lot lower just given the fact that sea levels were down 7 to 5 meters, but still well-watered, wetlands aplenty, and relatively stable. And then beginning somewhere around 6,500, there's evidence for much higher magnitude flood regime that affected much of the southeastern United States. We don't have any direct evidence for this yet at any of the sites on the St. John's, well, with one caveat I'll explain here in a moment. And then beginning around 5,500 years ago, potentially lower surface water elevations, some evidence for channel instability that might have orphaned some of these shell mounds. And then again, another possible high stand or a higher than normal precipitation regime beginning around the time of the Orange period. So even though it was, we can think about the St. John's as a relatively stable environment at one scale, at local scales it was probably quite dynamic. And that is clearly the case when we look at, this is Grove's Orange Midden, where Barbara Purdy and others identified this peat deposit dating around 6,500 years ago, suggesting higher than present surface level stands. People were still living there, they just actually moved their encampments upstream a little bit. More recently, the Laboratory of Southeastern Archaeology had the opportunity to excavate at Salt Springs, where they were putting in a new concrete revetment. You can see it right there. There was an accidental discovery of a submerged or saturated shell deposit by a backhoe. And Mike Russo and the Park Service went in, they did some emergency excavations, and then we were able to excavate a 10-meter long trench in about 5 days through this deposit that had been basically continuously wet for 6,000 years. And some of these trends show up within this deposit, suggesting that this regional model probably works out. More data will be coming out of that site soon. Since everything's been continuously wet for 6,000 years, we've had to keep it continuously wet in our lab. And so we have somewhere around, we've been able to get them down to about 100 gallon-sized bags filled with shell and bone. And the preservation's amazing, though. We've been pulling out 6,000-year-old gourds that look like they just fell off the branch. Human coprolites aplenty, which are a great resource for looking at hormones and parasite levels and everything else. So a real treasure trove of dietary information and paleoenvironmental information. But all that takes time. So hopefully we'll have some more results on that soon. Now, one of my goals with the LiDAR data, we've always known that there have been single ridges and multi-mound complexes on the valley, in the river valley, but we weren't quite sure exactly what that meant based on what C.B. Moore and Jeffries Wyman described. And so using the LiDAR, which is what we're looking at here, these are all topographic maps that have effectively been made from an airplane. These are two classic examples of shell mounds that are intact. We call these linear shell ridges. And then within the rest of the group here, you're looking at sites that have been mined. Like this is the Mount Taylor site itself. There's only about a meter of it left. This is Crow's Bluff. There's only about 50 centimeters of that site left on the surface. 8LA1 is another site that I'll talk about in detail here in a moment. And then complicated folks like LA89, which we really have no idea what's going on. And then here you can see clear evidence of this is a relic channel of the St. John's ran next to 8VO44 and basically bisected it in half. And so today, if you were to go up to it, you could still see an escarpment there from the river erosion. The single ridges are about half to a third the size of some of the larger complexes that are only found in certain locations. And these have all clearly been mined for shell. This is Hontoon Island North. Barbara Purdy dug over here. And it turns out that actually 80 to 90% of this site was actually once archaic and not St. John's period in age. This area here, we're pretty sure is a mortuary. There are 2 other mounds on the backside that were likely also archaic mortuaries. Another famous site is the Tick Island site here. Hard to see exactly what's going on, but you can see where the dredges came in, dug out a shell ridge here, dug out another one here, and of course dug out the heart, and this is where Bullen found all the archaic burials. And then the Bluffton site, which has basically been turned into an island in the middle of the St. John's. This is where Bullen also excavated, and this is where Sears excavated at an archaic, or what we're now certain is an archaic burial mound on the backside. And then, as a side note too, new data from John Andonino's work, which was just recently published in Florida Anthropologist, has worked at Thornhill Lake. He's shown conclusively that a lot of these sand mounds, which were long thought to be St. John's, woodland period or later constructions, are actually archaic in age. And these are isomorphic. These ones at Thornhill Lake, which is on the St. John's, are isomorphic with those at Tomoka Lake, which are also archaic, and these are on the coast. So a pretty interesting tradition of mound building that's, without shellfish. So when we look at the total, this is the total number of sites that we've been able to come up with. One thing that I didn't point out before, but I think we can see it now, is that we have this configuration here, our linear ridge, and then we have later ones that I'll explain a little bit more detail here in a moment, are not, these are pre-ceramic archaic or Mount Taylor in age. And these guys down here, these 2 here, and maybe this one, their final form dates largely to the Orange period. And this guy over here is a great example of a shell ring. And so in recent discovery, at least on the St. John's, is that we actually have shell rings not only on the coast, like have been found down here, or well, farther south at, say, Bonita Bay, but also we have them on the interior as well. Now, we've got this great data set now, and the point is to actually look at how shell mounds emerged from the small beginnings of a shell pile here and a shell pile there to these massive, truly monumental features on the landscape. We know the earliest context of the Mount Taylor period. We've got groups that were bringing our tools like classic Noonan points and others that were being made on materials from the West Coast all the way to interior Florida, but not on the St. John's because we don't have any outcrops, natural outcrops on the St. John's. And we also have groups that were living on the coast 7,000 years ago that were either importing marine shell tools and other objects. Whether or not folks in the interior of the interior St. John's were actually migrating from the coast to the interior is a question that's still of some debate. At any rate, so when we find out that these early sites, these early Mount Taylor sites, the best example that we have is from the Hontoon Dead Creek River Complex, which is on Hontoon Island and south of 8VO202. And this is almost entirely archaic mound here. And we also discovered a number of discrete shell deposits running all the way down the edge of the river terrace. I would also note that there is a submerged or saturated shell deposit that's underneath about a meter of water and muck that was filled in as sea level continued to rise. And so even though today we're on this really unenticing cypress swamp, 7,000 years ago this would have been fronting a really nice, beautiful lagoon. We now know that some of the earliest deposits are actually from these small residential middens that seem to have been repeatedly occupied, perhaps over the course of several years. But pretty soon after establishing this location as a place to dwell, we find that an actual rapid construction of these shell mounds. This one in particular, it's about 5 meters high. The lower 4 meters were built nominally at the moment we can say between 7,200 and 6,600 years ago. I think when we start to get some more radiocarbon dates, it'll show that this mound was built probably in the course of 100 to 200 years. So these aren't continuous, as has been thought. They were built rapidly, and not only that, they were built in stages. The basal component here was built of a number of large basket loads of shell, and which may have included a large class of concreted shell midden that had been mined out, maybe from a place like this, to use as construction fill. And then on top, they laid down programmatically these series of dark and light, or whole and burned and whole shell, burn and crush shell, whole shell, burn and crush shell. But there's no evidence that this is actually a place of day-to-day living. Right? We found no modified tools in this large excavation trench here, and very little fauna. And then eventually this site was abandoned, and people started living a little bit farther south. This is another little residential shell deposit that was visited several times over the course of maybe a generation. And the rest of these down here date to the Orange period and the later St. John's period. And so something happened, and that something that happened may have actually been that this channel was filled in, and that the large community efforts that it took to build this were no longer economically viable. That's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is that at the same time that they're constructing these massive shell mounds, they're also constructing burial mounds. And this has been documented at the Tick Island or the Harris Creek site, first by Bullen and then reinterpreted by Larry Ayton. And they discovered at the base of this massive shell mound, right, one of the most massive mounds in the river valley, that 7,300 to 7,000 years ago, a small multi-staged sand and shell mound was constructed, into which roughly 175 individuals were interred. Now, looking at the excavation records, and this is the sequence of it, the earliest deposit was actually one of these small residential shell bins that I was showing you, like on Hantoon Island, and then they converted it into a mortuary. And then over the course of, say, 200 years, they interred minimally 175 individuals. The shell mining, when it came in, all of this had already been destroyed. And so it's likely that this burial mound, again, dating to around 7,000 years ago, had upwards of 1,000 individuals interred in it before they stopped, before they basically capped it off and converted it into another kind of shell mound. Now, elsewhere, dating a little bit later in time, we do have linear ridges. This is a mined out version, and you're looking at the outline of it again. We do have these linear ridges that once you start digging into them, you find clear evidence for day-to-day occupation. And so just looking at this stratigraphic sequence, this is actually from a 6-meter long trench that we excavated there last year at the Silver Glen Run complex. That at the base, what you're seeing here are pits for some purpose. We're not entirely sure what. But upon these pits, we begin to find evidence of what was probably a large community effort to convert the space into truly habitable location. We find traces of sand that's been deposited in a mantle across the entire mound. Now, this mound at this point is roughly 2 meters above the floodplain. The St. John's, even though it will flood, normally doesn't deposit sand. And so this sand had to have been brought in from somewhere by the Native American groups. The sand, in some cases, was used for a number of thermal features. We have no idea what was actually going on, whether or not they're cooking hearths or something else. And then finally, we find a sequence that's strikingly similar to that which we found at the on Hantoon Island, dating around 500 to 1,000 years before this. But here, clear evidence for day-to-day living. This large bone here, if you look a little closer, it's bones all over the place. Lots of marine shell tools, bone tools, stone tools. No post holes, unfortunately. In fact, there's never been a post hole found in an archaic context in the St. John's, except in mortuary contexts. So we'll figure out why that is at some point in time. But when we look at them in cross-section, right, and you really need, these shell mounds are so complicated structurally that you need a really big picture. And this is the biggest picture that we've had, I think, to date, and it's still too small. Ken Sasson and I have a problem whenever we lay out an excavation unit, we almost always put it in an area that's been heavily disturbed, but don't figure that out until we're about halfway through the excavation. And this was a classic example of digging down, and every day is a new interpretation, and the field school students and the volunteers are about ready to kill us until we get down to the bottom. We're pretty sure that what we're looking at two big picture things here. One is a gigantic tree throw. So if you can, in your mind's eye, actually it comes down here, all the way down to the bottom, back up. So if you just black this out, what we're looking at are actually two different kinds of living surfaces. Over here, minimal trampling, very little crushed shell. On this side, tons of sand, lots of crushed shell, likely high activity area, probably house floors on this side of the mound. This side, probably a dumping area. And so in this case, good evidence for residential space. We see a number of transformations, though, that aren't explainable just by the infilling of channels or changes in where people are living for various and sundry reasons. We need to kind of increase the scope of the groups that we're studying. And we find that, again, along the St. John's, that these folks were dialed into a number of communities throughout much of the lower southeast. Most notably, they're incorporating after around 5,500 years ago. We see a dramatic rise in the number of Strombus gigas celts that are likely from southern Florida, particularly southeastern Florida. Stone beads coming in from Mississippi, and things like banner stones. They're being made in Georgia and South Carolina, like by the Stallings Islands group, and are somehow being exported down and finding their way into the St. John's. At the same time, the St. John's folks seem to be making marine shell beads and sending them upriver and up into the interior, where they're used as mortuary goods here. These objects can be found in any context. Banner stones, beads, and even shell beads here are almost always found in mortuary contexts. And unlike the earlier early Mount Taylor mortuary that we talked about at Harris Creek, there are new kinds of burial treatments that are being made that seem to be for either the objects themselves are being buried or individuals are being buried by themselves. And so at Tomoka, at Thornhill, we find mounds that have been constructed in stages, but these stages were done very rapidly. Normally they would clean off a pre-existing shell midden, they would burn that surface, an individual would be placed on top of that surface, and then a sequence of shellfish remains, sand and shell would be used to cap the individual. Some of whom, like at Thornhill, were found with 4 or 5 banner stones, thousands of marine shell beads, and other objects. So clearly people of power around 55 to 4,700 years ago. A more classic example is the Bluffton burial mound, and this place had a single individual emplaced where we have shell, sand, shell, and then a layer of what's called black gumbo, which was likely muck that had been mined out of the wetland. Some of it actually has been interpreted as alligator feces. Might have also been used. And then thereafter, a large cap was placed on this mound. So these aren't the big community midden mounds that we saw earlier. These are for individuals. And then we have what Ken and I lately have been calling a New World Order. Right? We have this really vibrant monument construction for the dead. We've got people living in shell mounds throughout much of the river valley. And then all of a sudden, around 4,700 years ago, 4,500 years ago, all of that stops. right? And we find people living in only certain areas. And this seems to be coeval with the influx of either people or pottery from the coast at the beginning of the Orange period. And so we know we have 4 areas where we find predominantly orange-incised pottery, which even though it used to be thought that it was late because it was decorated, it's actually as early as the plain pottery. And so we've got the really nice decorated pottery only found at 4 locations, and we have plain pottery found throughout the rest of the region. And these these decorated assemblages are separated by about 20 to 30 kilometers, right? And so this suggests a new kind of kinds of social boundaries, right, between groups living on the St. Johns. Now, importantly, many of them seem to be U-shaped. And so what we're looking at here, this is a reconstruction of the Silver Glen Run or Silver Glen Spring in the northern portion of the Middle St. Johns. Unfortunately, there's no easy way to put a scale on here. This is roughly about 1 kilometer long, and all these areas that I've highlighted here are shell deposits. This was an early Mount Taylor shell mound around the spring boil. This is the mound that I was showing you the cross-section of a little bit earlier of LA1 Locus A. This area over here is the later Woodland St. John's period. But then we have a small, what's called Locus B area. This is where we find mostly plain orange pottery. And then we have the Big Behemoth. Now, where we find orange decorated pottery. Now, I do need to point out that this is a reconstruction. In the 1920s, this entire landform was flattened. It was sold, shell from all of these locations was sold for around $17,000. And so this here is an interpretation based actually on really good maps that were made in the 1800s of what this mound would have looked like 4,000 years ago. About 300 meters on a side and about 10 meters high. Now what's interesting is that when we look at these two different localities, this is the small orange compound with the plain pottery, we find that in some ways they look like habitation sites. This is a large block excavation we excavated this summer, but they're also digging massive quantities of pits, perhaps best seen here. The pits are about 1 meter deep, if not 2 meters deep. They seem to be for processing shellfish, roasting shellfish, and much more than you would expect just for community level production. And what we think is going on is that you actually have local communities on the landscape processing shellfish for consumption and sharing at these massive U-shaped amphitheaters, right, where we've been finding all of the decorated pottery. And again, this is a reconstruction, but I think it's a pretty accurate reconstruction. So where does this leave us? Going back to this idea of whether or not it was regional continuity, right, through time, or whether or not it was food remains, I think what we've been able to show, at least at the very beginning, is that we can't take just the shape of these sites or their location as a given, or we can't take them at face value, right? That it's going to take a lot of work to actually look at their changing sequences through time to see how they could have been used by different groups for different reasons, right? So we see that early on we have these massive linear ridges that are being constructed not as places to dwell, but arguably for large community ceremonies. These same linear shapes, however, are also showing up later in time where people are literally living on top of the shell mounds. So they more approximate how we think of shell mounds. And then finally, when we look at the Orange period, right, we find that people have gone and they've created these massive amphitheaters, not for living again, but for probably regional scale celebrations. In some cases, they included the dead, and in some cases it was just the living that were partaking in these events. Regardless, I think that instead of just purely assuming that since these were made by hunter-gatherers and that they're early, that they're somehow simple, and in fact they're significantly more complex. So looking forward, we'll find out more of that, I think, enduring complexity. So thank you. Yeah.
Do you have any idea what the population of the area was?
Well, part of the reason that we've been going back, one of the things that we still don't know is were these mounds inhabited serially, or were they inhabited, you'd go build one shell mound and then you'd build another, or were all, say 20 mounds all being inhabited at the same time? We don't know yet. It's quite possible that it was a standard macro band of maybe 300 to 500 individuals living throughout the valley. It's also possible that it was up in the thousands. What we don't know, this is another, there are many things that we're only beginning to even think about, but what we don't know is how many individuals were migrating into the St. John's, say just for a month or two. We don't know, we know that there is a resident population of individuals, and we know that some people were moving in from as far south as southern Florida and as far north as Tennessee and Virginia, based on isotopic studies. But whether or not people are just showing up occasionally, or whether or not it was a year-round thing, is unknown. So.
During this time period, they didn't have to. They were far enough away from the shore. They didn't have to worry about storm surges during hurricanes. They don't represent high ground.
No, and in fact, I mapped them out. They, all of the basal dates that we have are at the normal high level for the annual floods, and so they had already mapped on to where the flood levels would stop 75% of the time. And frankly, when you look at, say, here, let me go back here. When you look at this site at Silver Glen, all you have to do to get out of the floodwaters is move uphill, literally a 20-foot walk, and you're outside of the flood regime. Now, that doesn't count for the 100-year or 200-year floods, right? But the normal annual 10-year decadal floods, these guys are living, they're already above it before they even start building the mounds.
Involvement, how many months do you stay there, and how long have you been involved in this project?
I've been working on the St. John's since 2003. Every summer for 5 to 6 weeks, the University of Florida does a field school, and so we'll take 15 to 20 students. We first started working at Hantoon Island State Park, where they've got cabin, really primitive cabins set up. We'd bring, our refrigerators, and we'd bring, all these other things for cooking out there, and we'd basically camp for 5 to 6 weeks. In 2007, we started working at a private hunting club, and they have their own ice maker, and and it's been a little bit more posh, setup. But yeah, we normally spend about 5 to 6 weeks a summer. The benefit for me is that it's so close to home. I mean, it's an hour-and-a-half drive, and so if I need to know something, if I need another GPS reading of something, I can just drive over there, which is different from when I used to live in Alabama, or work in Alabama.